Rolling. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for adjusting your schedule to come here and listen to our guest speaker today. I really appreciate that. This is Dr. Brad Hobbs from Florida Gulf Coast University. He is the assistant basketball coach of the Dunk City Madmen. I've known Dr. Hobbs for a while. We do some research together. He's actually contributing a chapter to one of the books that I'm working on with a couple of people from another university on entrepreneurship and policy. And he's got the BB&T chair of private enterprise at Florida Gulf Coast University. So I'm just going to let him take the floor and talk to us.
All right, well, welcome. Thanks for being here on a day that's blowing a little bit. Got a little bit of rain in it. It's a nice area. I drove from Charleston. It's kind of pretty dry. I grew up in coastal Florida, so I'm used to this kind of stuff. Glad you all have boats. You're lucky. You're lucky people. We're lucky people in lots of ways, and I think that one of the reasons that we're lucky is because we live in a time where we have access to things that we would never have access to without a system that we call capitalism. Michael Moore's got a great movie, Capitalism, a Love Story. Very critical of capitalism, but Michael Moore lives in a nest of capitalist goods and doesn't seem to quite recognize what he's got. So what I've done here is I've thought about this a lot in the sense that I was a history major undergraduate and I took 3 econ courses, and then I figured out that history professors didn't make any money, but econ professors made a little more. And also, if you were an econ, you could do something besides be a professor. You could actually go and do some kind of work somewhere. So I thought, well, options are good. As my finance friends put it, lunch options have value. So I switched and I became an econ major. But I still have a very strong connection to history. I have 2 or 3 reading stacks in my office. One of them is a history stack, and I just kind of keep filling it up. So I've followed this for quite a while. Kind of what triggered it is a book that I'll talk about that came out by a colleague of ours at George Mason University. But I've been following this stuff for quite a long time anyway, just because I was interested in it. So the title of this is What's to Love About Capitalism. Another title about it could be Historical Living Standards. And that's really what it's about, is historical living standards. Is capitalism a scourge or is it a blessing? Is it Fidel Castro's view of the world in which the capitalists bathe themselves in the blood of the people, capitalist pigs? Or is it a cornucopia? Does it provide a lot of stuff? And I think we're going to probably end up on this side, I don't know. Popular images of economics and economists and of people that have wealth are very, very caricature. They're very, very common. Okay, if we look at them, it doesn't matter if we go from the 1920s, which is when this picture was done, to today, it's always a fat guy with a cigar with money around him. Okay, it's not uncommon at all to see these. Whenever you look at cartoons or caricatures, wealth looks like this. Always a fat guy. The metaphor that a lot of people have about wealth is that it's about war. The war metaphor is, I think, the wrong metaphor, but people believe that wealth is something that is a pie that should be carved up. It's a static notion of what wealth is. Wealth actually is a very dynamic concept. It moves a lot, believe it or not. And so I think this sort of metaphor about wealth and war is always good to get people riled up. So I've just gone through and picked out some pictures of things I found on the net. This is one that I really liked. Capitalism, bringing you lower quality and fewer choices since the 16th century. This is David Suzuki. I don't know if you've ever seen him. He's on NPR quite a bit. And basically what he says in here is that the biological system is a natural system. Why would you ever subsume the biosphere inside of things like capitalism, free enterprise, the economy, currency, the market? These are not forces of nature. We invented them. How many of you have ever read Hayek or been exposed to Hayek at all? Okay. I think Hayek might take a little umbrage with that. The market itself is actually, according to Hayek, much like a biological system. But people believe that we can just throw the market out, kit and caboodle, and kind of do whatever we want to. The market's not immutable. We can change these things. It makes no sense to elevate economics above the biosphere. So this is pretty common stuff. Standard criticisms are capitalism is an exploitative system. Capitalism is an oppressive system. There are aspects of capitalism that can be exploitive and oppressive. I mean, that's absolutely true. But I would maintain that they're a pretty minor slice of exchange. One place, of course, that you can exploit is decide on property rights, right? So the connection of freedom and property rights to a capitalist world is a very important one. If you ever had a chance to read Milton Friedman's book on capitalism and freedom, that first chapter or two in that book are great in kind of outlining that. There's also another problem, I think, with economics, and it's what I call the sports metaphor, that if somebody wins, somebody else has to lose. And it's a zero-sum game, if you've ever heard that term. Actually, trade is not a zero-sum game, it's a positive-sum game. When I go to the 7-Eleven in the summer, like I like to do, when it starts to get good and hot in July and August in southwest Florida, I live in a swamp. You do too, it looks like, or at least pretty close. It gets kind of muggy, it gets kind of hot, right? And I would go and I buy those Slurpees, you know, those little ice drinks that you can get at the Minute Saver, and they're about $2. So I put down my $2 and I think, gosh, you know, that guy's giving me a Slurpee for $2. I walk away as happy as I can be. And what does he think? That sucker just gave me $2 for a Slurpee. Idiot. I'm happy, right? So I walk away happy, he walks away happy, or he stays there happy. And so exchange is not a zero-sum game. It's not that if you engage in exchange, that one side wins and one side loses, as I like to put it. In another way is nobody's ever held a gun to my head and said, buy this or you will die. Everything I bought freely. Now, I might grouse about some of it, like when I went to close on my house and I figured out there's 17 people with their finger in my pie. But it's the reality. I mean, that's the way it is. Another criticism is just kind of straight out nasty. Capitalists are greedy, rapacious bastards. I'll stop there. After we do that in my class, I use the word one time, and then after that we always call them GRPs. You know, what are these people up to? Well, they're just a bunch of greedy, rapacious people. They're just taking stuff, right? Another metaphor that really gets under my skin is that capitalists have to give back. You're going to hear this throughout your lifetime. And my question to that is, give back what? What did they take? I mean, the capitalist at the Minute Saver didn't take anything from me. I took from him. I took the Slurpee, right? The notion that you have to give back implies that there was some sort of taking that occurred before that, and I simply reject that. I buy things in a market. I have income. I spend that income in certain ways. There are things I don't like to spend on, like maybe taxes, but there's some things that I need to buy, and I go buy them, and I'd rather not buy them maybe, but I choose to buy them. Nobody forces me to buy them. So that's another issue that comes up quite a bit that kind of gets under my skin. So I talk about that for a minute. I don't know how many of you have ever seen The Story of Stuff. If you haven't, you should watch it. It's on YouTube. It's Annie Leibovitz, or Lenowitz is her name. I can't remember exactly. She was a director at Greenpeace, and she tells the whole story about how we're ruining the world. Of course, her metaphor for a capitalist is a fat guy with a hat with a dollar sign on him. And of course, the people are over here sitting on the house of government with peace signs. But this kind of stuff is very, very common. And you can find it all over the web. And the reality is, we do have a problem as capitalists and as free market people. It's a big problem. Capitalism doesn't make goosebumps. Okay, it's not an emotional event for most people, unless you're like really nutso entrepreneur. Then it really is. I've known some entrepreneurs, some very successful entrepreneurs, and I can tell you that not one of them is driven by money. Money's the byproduct of what they do. They can't stop themselves. I mean, they are addicted to I call it the buzz. They just they're serial entrepreneurs. They just can't stop. They try to stop once in a while when they retire, but, I've watched these guys, they never stop. They say they're retired, but they're not. They're lying to you. They're not retired. They're always working some kind of deal. They're always kind of interested in the game, okay, interested in what's going on. When we see Ty on Home Makeover, and he pulls up and there's somebody in a house that's got some kind of problem that we know about, we're told about the problem, whatever it is, they build them a mini mansion, right, and then they have the bus there and the family behind the bus. They drive the bus away and everybody cries. And I mean, even I get goosebumps, I'll have to admit. You know, a Spockian guy like me, I get goosebumps. But the reality is, you know, that's easy to connect to. This is very hard to connect to. These are Guatemalans. A friend of mine took this picture in Guatemala. This is a place outside of the major city of Guatemala City that everyone meets on Saturdays, and they have basically a market. It's known for its flowers. You can see lots of flowers in here, but there's a market on the other side of this picture. They bring all kinds of fruits and vegetables and handicraft goods and all that sort of stuff. And that's not going to get on television, right? But this is what most people engage in. They don't engage in this. This is showmanship. This is the reality of most markets, and it's pretty darn mundane when you get down to it. It's not that sexy, okay? So that's part of our problem is, you know, we don't get the goosebump factor. But on a day-to-day basis, this is a very important component, okay? I see a guy chewing gum back there. He got the gum somewhere. I don't think you made it, right? And in fact, everything that you have on you or with you, I am pretty much willing to bet that not much of it you made. But almost all of it you got through a market. You got here in a car that you got through a market. You got here with gasoline that you got in the market. You got here with hairspray you got in the market. You got here with a watch on that you got in the market. Name the thing in your life that you didn't get through a market. Okay? And it's pretty hard to do. I mean, I make pottery. I have a little pottery studio in my house, right? And I make little pots. But I get the clay from the market. I get the electricity from the market. I get the kiln from the market. I get the glazes from the market. I got the spray booth from the market. I got all the stuff I use to make this stuff. The reality is I couldn't do it without the market. I live in a place where I could never find clay. I can find lots of sand, but I can't find much clay. So I'd like to develop some historical perspective on human progress, particularly because I think now the thing that you hear most is the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. We're all going to die. This is a horrible thing. There's deforestation and biodiversity loss. There's population growth. We're all going to starve to death. There's epidemics, pestilence, and plague. Global warming, of course, is a big one. You live on the coastal. And these are kind of apocalyptic visions which have a very long mainstay in human societies. Doesn't matter what human society we look at and what historical period, there's always an apocalyptic story. The four horsemen in the Bible are conquest, war, famine, and death. They kind of sit there waiting to come to us at any point. And so it's kind of depressing if you really, you know, buy into all this stuff. And this brings me to the book. Okay, so the book was written by Brian Kaplan, who's an economist at George Mason University. He wrote a book called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And it's very interesting what he did. There's a survey about economic knowledge that's done by a large survey group. And they do it periodically, and they give it to a random sample of population inside America. And then they give it to a bunch of economists. And they compare the information that the economists have to the information that the general population has. And the economists they're giving it to are in the American Economic Association, which means that almost all of them have PhDs in economics. And so what they're doing is trying to see what's the gap between kind of PhD economic knowledge and Joe on the street knowledge. Okay? And it's kind of a long story what Kaplan does with this book, but it's been a very influential book. But he basically uses statistical techniques to graft on PhD level economic knowledge onto the general population and ask where would they end up on issues if they had this additional knowledge. Okay, and it's kind of, the whole book's about that. But the reason I like the book is pedagogy. The first two chapters are just great chapters to use in a class. And the second chapter in particular, where he identifies places where there's this massive gap between general population and people who really know economics. Okay? And the gaps that he identifies here are the four. The first two are pretty obvious, I think. People don't like markets, the anti-market bias. Economists tend to believe that markets work relatively well. The anti-foreign bias, Okay, you might have heard Rob talk about immigration. I'm sure that he thinks we should lock down the borders and make sure that there's no more damn Mexicans coming in here, right? I'm being completely facetious. Economists tend to be relatively open to immigration for very good reasons. I don't know anybody in this country that's not an immigrant. Any Native Americans in here? Okay, so guess what? At some point, you're an immigrant. So the anti-foreign bias. The make-work bias, that's a little bit harder to explain. It's not obvious from the name. But I have a great story that I think will get it in your head forever. Milton Friedman goes to China. He sees this public works project. And there's all these Chinese with shovels literally moving dirt for a public works project. Milton Friedman says, why don't you get those guys front-end loaders? Why don't you have equipment and capital to do this work? And they said, Professor Friedman, you don't understand. This is a work project. We're putting people to work. And he thought for a second. He looked at his translator and he said, well, tell them to get them spoons. Because we'll hire a lot more people with spoons, right? It makes no sense. We don't want to make work by making people less inefficient. We'd rather make people more efficient and get more done by fewer people. That means that people may have to find other things to do, but that's the nature of life, right? We don't have buggy whip makers anymore. They're horse harnessing guys. So the make work bias. But the one that I'm on for the rest of the time here today is this pessimistic bias. Okay? People tend to be quite pessimistic and about the economy, and this is a little bit more detail on this one. We have a tendency to overestimate the severity of an economic problem. We kind of get caught up in the tempest in the teapot, and we underestimate how well the economy has worked in the past, present, and how well it's likely to work in the future. I call this the good old days fallacy. Before he wrote this book, I actually used to talk about this stuff in class anyway before the book came out. I called it the good old days fallacy. That things used to really be great back in the good old days before we ruined the world. And that's simply, in my view, not true. And I'm going to give you lots of evidence in the next 30 minutes or so here of why that's not true. There's a failure to understand how far we've come, because it's kind of phenomenal how far we've come, particularly in the last 200 years or so. And we need to develop, I think, a little bit more perspective on the quality of life that you have. It's really pretty stunning. In historical terms, it's very likely that you live in the top 1% of all people who've ever lived on the earth, as far as wealth. I mean, that's hard for some of you to realize, I think, but if you look at it historically, you look at every soul that's ever been on the earth, you're probably in the top 1%. I mean, it's kind of stunning when you really sit back and think about it. This is very widespread. This is a survey done in 2010 on the American Dream. 68% of Americans believe that it will be harder for their children to achieve it than it was for them. 45% rated it as much harder. Only 32% believe America's on the ascension or the rise, and 58% believe that we're in a downward spiral, on a decline. When asked of a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the highest about achieving the American dream, the mean score was 4.5 out of 10. Okay, that's 45%. 5% of the surveyed respondents gave it the highest score, that's 10. That's 1 in 20 people said, the American dream's here, I can get it. Okay? The number that chose 7 through 10 was the same number that chose 1, which is the lowest rating. So the top 30% of people matched the bottom 10% of people, or the 10% at the bottom. What's kind of interesting about it also is that first generation and second generation immigrants were more rosy about their future. They rated it slightly higher than did other people. So African Americans and Latinos were consistently more positive, and as were first and second generation immigrants. All right, has anybody ever heard of this bet? Okay, you've heard of it, anybody else? Okay, so there's these two guys. This is 1969, this book is written. I actually have the book. It's written by Paul Ehrlich. Ehrlich is now, I think, at Stanford University. He's the something professor of sustainability at Stanford. And he wrote this book about the population bomb, and he said things in it like, India by 1985 will be a complete basket case. There will be massive starvation across all of India. He made all kinds of insinuations about how the world was going to fall apart in the next 20 years because of growing population. Okay? Paul Ehrlich is a biologist and he's a pessimist. Okay? And he wrote this book. This book was a bestseller. Lots of people bought the book. Lots of people read the book. Lots of people believed the book. And he was arguing on the stage in a debate with a guy named Julian Simon. This is Ehrlich on the left and Simon on the right. Simon's dead. He died about 4 years ago, I think. But Paul Ehrlich still, like I said, he's at one of the California universities, something professor of sustainability. And they had a very interesting bet. What Simon did towards the end of the debate was he said, look, I have a list here of 70 basic raw materials. I will give you this list. You pick any 5 you want to pick. We'll bet $200 on each one, okay, for a 10-year period. And what we'll do is if you pick 10 as one of those, we'll mark it today at $200 worth of 10. And in 10 years, let's meet again, and the price will either have gone up or it will have gone down. Now, if you're right, the prices of all this stuff will go up because we're running out of resources, the world's going to heck in a handbasket, population's going to take over, we're all going to starve to death. If you're right, that's going to go up. And Ehrlich said, you're right. Absolutely it's going to go up. He said, I'll take the bet. All right, so they took the bet. By the way, one of the people that helped Ehrlich pick these out is John Holden, who is now in the Obama administration. He's one of the environmental guys in the Obama administration. They picked 5 things, all right, out of a list of about 70. And they said, these 5 raw materials are what we're going to bet on. So the way the bet works is, if it was $200, okay, so you got $1,000 altogether. You with me? $200 on each of the 5, $1,000. That is an index. And that index is either going to rise or fall. So Ehrlich says, well, it's going to rise. And Simon says, no, it's not. It's going to fall. And they're going to cover the gap, whatever the gap is. Okay, so there's a limitation on the downside at least. Well, this is what happened. They made the bet in 1980, and they solved the bet in 1990, or completed the bet in 1990. They picked chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten. The price of all 5 fell. And in the end, Ehrlich had to write a check to Simon for $576. Okay? So this was a situation where you could pick any of 70. It was your pick, and all 5 of them fell. Now, why would that happen? When population's growing, when the economies are growing? I mean, was the 1980s a horrible time for the economy? No, it was a great time for the economy, right? There was a lot of growth, right? Now, Simon says, as Simon would say, is that they picked a particular 10-year period. And really, Simon's thinking long term. I'm thinking in 100-year periods, not 10-year periods. So he says, you know, we got lucky. I'll grant that. But if we look at long-term periods, this is what's happening to these prices. They're coming down. So Ehrlich lost the bet. Simon won the bet. Ehrlich had to write him a check. This is played out all the time. Okay, peak oil is one of the things that you'll hear about. If you read the National Geographic, you hear about it all the time. And I'm just going to go through this and kind of point out a couple things. The things in red are kind of important to think about. Peak oil is the simplest label for the problem of energy resource depletion. I completely agree. It's a simple label. Okay? Or more specifically, the peak in global oil production. Oil is a finite, non-renewable resource. That's true. There's so much of it. We don't know how much there is, but there's only so much of it. In the abstract, you're absolutely right. It's powered phenomenal economic and population growth over the last century and a half. That's true. The rate of oil production, meaning extraction and refining, is whatever it is per day. That's an empirical fact. We can check that. That's true. Okay? It's grown almost every year of the last century. That's true. Okay? Everything's true so far, and I can agree with it. Now, it starts to get a little squirrely here. once we've used up about half of the original reserves. Well, let me ask you, what do you mean half of the original reserves? What is original? Was that last year's reserves, or was that reserves 10 years ago? I mean, because it turns out that the reserves grow every single year. It's amazing how much they grow. Okay, and I'm going to show you this in just a minute. This is kind of fun. Oil production becomes ever more likely to stop growing. We're going to hit peak production. Okay, the peak in oil production does not signify that we've run out. We'll never run out of oil, by the way. I'll bet my daughter's lives on it, and I love my daughters dearly, more than anything in the world. But it does not mean the end of cheap oil as we switch from a buyer's to a seller's market. Holy smokes, there's buyers in the market, and there's sellers in the market, and the price changes. For economies leveraged on ever-increasing quantities of cheap oil, now come the four horsemen. They come galloping. You can hear them. Here they come, clopping, clopping, clop. The consequences may be desired. Without significant, successful cultural reforms, severe economic and social consequences seem inevitable. We get the doomsday scenario at the end, right? Let me show you exactly what oil has done over the last 30 years or so. This is sort of the picture that's painted. It's a horrible picture. We wouldn't want anybody that we love or hate to be in that kind of position. This is a story that we've heard before. This is from an 1865 book. The book was written by Stanley Jevons, who was the one of the three main figures in the marginal revolution of moving economics to calculus. The book was written in 1865. It was called The Coal Question, an inquiry concerning the progress of the nation and the probable exhaustion of our coal mines. This is coal consumption, this line here. I know it's kind of hard to see, but you get the idea. This is 1600, 1700, 1800, and we're about right here, okay? What he's projecting is that by 1900 it rises to here, and by the year 2000, what happens to the coal consumption in the world? Just completely shoots through the roof, right? And he writes a book and says, look, we're going to run out of coal. Coal is the primary resource for everything that we do. It's the way we power our machines. It's the way we heat our homes. If we run out of coal, this is going to be a catastrophe, okay? At this time, if you lived in a city and you had heat in your house, it's very likely the only source that you had was coal. Anybody seen a coal bin in a house? Anybody been up north enough to see a coal bin? How many of you have ever shoveled coal into the fire?
Into a furnace.
Our guy up here with, well, I'd say you're 60. Yeah, 66. He might have seen one. And when I was a kid, I remember coal bins. We lived in Florida, so we didn't have them. But I had relatives up north, and we'd visit, and the coal bin was kind of a cool place to go around and clunk around in, right? But this is what they predicted in 1865. This book, by the way, was taken very seriously. We're going to run out of coal. The same story I could tell about wood. There's a very good book written by a forester called The Depletion Myth, Wood, coal and wood. It's a great story also. But this is the graph I kind of wanted to get to that kind of got me really thinking about this more hard than I used to. I said to myself, well, I know there's problems with these reserves, and they're always adjusting the reserves, and usually the adjustment is up. So if I took the amount of known oil in a year, let's say in 1980, and I divided it by the amount of oil used per year in 1980, how many years would we have left? I mean, it's a very kind of crude measure, but it gives you some sense of sort of change over time. And here's the answer. These are years here, okay? And you can see the bars run between about 28 and all the way up to 43. I know you can't see the numbers, but you can see the bars are running in that range, right? What this says is that in 1980, if I take the amount of known reserves and I divide it by current consumption per year, that we would have 28 years of oil left and we would run out. So when should we run out if we start in 1980? Add 28, sounds like 2008 to me. That number should have no bar. We should have run out in 2008, okay? But if you look, these bars all stay up there. They climb a bit in here, They're coming down some here, but then they jump up again. So what's going on here? Why is it that those bars never go down to zero like we might predict they would? Well, people find oil all the time. And you find oil not just by physically finding oil, you also find oil by driving Priuses instead of Cadillacs. That's a way to find oil. We don't think about that, but think about substitutes. If you want to cut oil use, a Prius is a good substitute for oil. You've got to think about it in a broader sense. So if you look at the number of years reserve remaining, this is the kind of information that you get. This is the story of Bakken Shale. I don't know if you've heard about Bakken Shale. Bakken Shale sits under South Dakota, North Dakota, and Wyoming, I think. It's a big field underneath the ground. In 1995, the U.S. Geological Survey estimated there were 150 million barrels. Million barrels. Okay? You get out to April 2008, they go, well, it's not 150 million, instead it's 4 billion barrels. Okay, so from 150 million to 4 billion is a huge jump. 2 years later, they double the estimate. It's not 4 billion, it's 8 billion. 2 years later, they say, wait a second, it's not 8 billion, there's 24 billion. That's 3 times as much in 2 years. Current technology today can extract out 6% of the oil that's in the shale. 6%, that leaves 94, just in case we're doing that math in our heads, right? Between 1 to 2 miles of subsurface. Now they're estimating 500 billion barrels of oil with this technology. Now what do you think is going to happen to this technology over time?
Become more efficient.
It's going to become better, trust me. There are many petro engineers and chemical companies and engineering companies and oil companies that are going, holy smokes, this thing's a gold mine. Let's figure out how to make that number go up. What if you made that number go to 9% and you stayed just within 1 and 2 miles below the surface? That's a 50% increase. This number would go to 750 billion barrels, right? Now that's hard, that doesn't sound like much, right? But those kind of changes are hard, but I have no doubt that this is going to hit 9%. I don't know when, but I suspect within the next 5 to 10 years, that number is going to be higher because they'll figure out how to be more efficient in the extraction processes. So what's positive about capitalism? We've talked about all the horrible things that are coming. This is a poster I actually have in my office. The pyramid of the capitalist system. It's got the money's on top, the capitalist is on top, big bag of money. You've got to have money signs somewhere. The rulers are next. That's the king and the government. The priests and the church and the clergy are next. We fool you. We rule you. We fool you. This is the army. We shoot you. This is the wealthy. We eat for you. And then this is the workers that hold everything up, right? We feed all. We work for all. One of the things that I've come to believe after teaching for 30 years is that one of my most fundamental jobs in teaching is to pull the rug out from under people, because they come into the world, into my world, with a fundamental set of preconceptions. And I often find that they're crazy wrong. They just aren't right. I mean, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of empirical evidence, there's a lot of history that tells us that things aren't quite the way you think they are. So my job, I view it as to kind of pull rugs out from under students. That could be in all sorts of different ways, but to get you off kilter enough that you say, wait a second, I need to think about this for a minute. I've always believed it's like this, but maybe I should, dig a little deeper. Maybe I should engage in what now it's fancy, they call it critical thinking, right? I call it pulling the rug out from under people. But what we need to see is what's right in front of us, and sometimes that requires a constant struggle, as George Orwell said. If you never read George Orwell, you should read some Orwell. Another view is Montesquieu. You might have heard of Montesquieu. Montesquieu talked about commerce being sweet commerce or doux commerce, because people that had interests tended to fight less than people that didn't have interests. There's a great book about this called The Passions and the Interests. Arguments for Capitalism Prior to Its Ascendancy by Hirschman.
that I have my students read when I do a course on Adam Smith. This, by the way, is Adam Smith. This is a bolo tie with the head of Adam Smith. Adam Smith told us that exchange was to be viewed as mutual gain rather than exploitation. He railed against capitalism in the sense of crony capitalism. Today we call it crony capitalism. Back then they called it mercantilism. We look at wealth generation through human action and entrepreneurship. People generate wealth. Wealth doesn't just show up. Wealth is not the Fed printing more money. That's just inflation. Wealth gets created by people making products that you want to buy, like Dell. Now, Mr. Dell started in a dorm room at a Texas university and became a multimillionaire. What's happening with Mr. Dell today?
He's buying it. He's taking his own company private if he can.
He's trying to take his company private, but
Blackstone's in the way.
Blackstone's in the way, and the future of those kinds of machines is looking pretty darn bleak. You know, the machines that you grow up with are not the machines that you're going to live with in the future. Just ask this fella and me. When I went to the university, I took my record player with my 5 orange crates full of albums.
And your typewriter and your slide rule.
And we had typewriter. Now, slide rule, I was ahead of slide rule. We got a little gap between us, okay? But the first calculator I got, I remember I wanted this calculator, and my dad said he'd get it for me to go to the University of Florida. And when he found out how much it cost, he about went through the roof. But he bought it. It would do neat things like divide and subtract and multiply. The calculators you buy today are unbelievable relative to this. And we'll talk about some of this in a minute. Music was one of my favorites, because I'm an absolute aficionado of music. I listen to music all the time. I have like retro tube amps, and I have a set of speakers that's this high that was custom built by my nut brother-in-law. I mean, he is nuts. I mean, and you know, I have all kinds of audiophile equipment, and I listen to music all the time. I've gone through, well, I had a friend that had a reel-to-reel. You ever seen one of those? Okay. Then we went to albums. Then we went to what?
8 tracks.
8 tracks. Come on, older folks, help me out. 8 tracks, cassettes, CDs.
Well, laser disc before CDs.
Oh yeah, I remember the laser disc. We still have one of those in the closet.
Sure, that must
at my
be George.
university, right? Got the CDs, and now everything's MP3, right? And has gone to an iPod. Okay, mark the day. Remember me only one time in the future in your life. The day you take that iPod and you stick it in the drawer and go, what a piece of crap that is. This new thing is so cool. My golly, I can't believe it. I used to use that old iPod, right? That's going to happen. Trust me. A lot of you probably don't carry an iPod. I do. Rob might. These guys might. You probably have yours on your phone or something, right? How many of you have music on your phone? Yeah, there you go, right? I don't know what's coming down the pike, but I hope I live long enough to see it. Another nice thing about some of this is that the traditional values of prudence, hard work, and thrift are often associated with capitalism. To be a good capitalist, you've got to be prudent, you've got to work hard, you have to be thrifty, and you do have to be lucky. Okay? You have to be in the right place at the right time. Okay? But what you find is there are people that kind of put themselves in the position to be in the right place at the right time, it turns out. But prudence is something that I think is a totally lost virtue in our culture, and that's kind of a shame. I'm the guy that when I went to the bank to get my loan for my house, and the banker said he'd loan me $300,000, I would look at him and say, I think you're nuts. I wouldn't loan me $300,000. And that's exactly why they wanted to loan me $300,000, because I was the guy that said, no, I don't need that, right? I buy half the house, they're going to buy for me, but then again, I put furniture in it, and I get to send 2 kids to college. I don't have the newest TVs. I'll wait till the prices come down. I'll live watch prices come down. I'm an economist. Nothing like watching prices just come down. Okay? All right. This is from Mises, Anti-Capitalist Mentality. Have any of you ever read this book or heard of Mises? It's a great short book that you should take a look at sometime. And he notes that the emergence of economics as a new branch of knowledge is one of the most portentous events in the history of mankind. In a few generations, it transformed all of human affairs more radically than the preceding 10,000 years. And this is what he meant. Okay, this is from the Millennium edition of the Economist magazine. This is on the work of a fellow named Angus Madison, who is an economic historian that's done a lot of work on sort of over long periods of time. This numbers over here, that's real GDP adjusted to the year 2000. This is year 1 AD through the year 2000. Okay? Now this is the first 1,000 years. What happened to this line in the first 1,000 years? Well, let me see. First of all, it's probably at about 500 bucks. Right? And what happened to that line? Did it go up or down or what?
Slightly
Come on,
down.
y'all
Slightly
engage.
down.
Stay
Slightly
flat? Pretty flat. 1,000 years. Stayed right at 500 bucks. And then we go into this massive climb, right? And it goes. It's phenomenal, but it's very, very slow. By the time we get to about 1840, this number hits $1,000 per capita. Now this is only Western Europe, okay? This is just Western Europe because that's where you can get data. So we get to about $1,000 per capita in 1840. Look what happens to this line. In 1840, this thing turns massively, and it shoots straight up. It's well over $22,000 per capita of GDP by the year 2000. That's only 160 years. And so for me, the big question in economics is how in the heck did that happen? What happened there? Why did we end up with that? This is a great little graph. It tells you about all the different inventions. This is the printing press, just prior to 1440. This is the padded horse collar. If you actually are interested in this stuff, I've got a great book about, a history book about all this stuff. And you know, you don't think of a padded horse collar as being an innovation, but it was a massive innovation because it allowed you to harness a horse. Prior to that, who pulled the plow?
Your wife. No.
Yeah.
No.
Literally. I mean, people pulled the plow. They pulled the plow. Until they figured out how to put a padded collar on a horse, people pulled the plow. So you can imagine what that was like. But there's kind of neat stuff in here. This is radio, Edison's lamp, Bell telephone, first transatlantic cable. You can't see all that from the back, but this is kind of a really neat graph just to sit and ponder for about 5 or 10 minutes sometime. But here's the question. How did we go from here to there? Because that's stunning. One of the ways I introduce this in a class is this. I talk about battlefield surgery in the Civil War. So I ask this question, does anyone know who the best surgeon in the Civil War was?
Probably a butcher.
I'll give you a hint.
Butchers.
That's the toolkit. That's what you went into the field with. Okay? You have a saw. You have 5 or 6 different knives. You got a few clamps. You got a tourniquet. Okay? So who was the best surgeon? If you could pick one guy, who would you pick?
Considering the death rate of Civil War operations, none of them.
Yeah, you wouldn't want any of them, but that wasn't your choice.
The butcher.
The butcher? How about this? There's no anesthesia. That should help. Which one do you want now?
Whoever's quickest.
The quickest guy in the field. This is from the How-To Field Guide for Surgery in the Civil War. Direct quote out of this book. This was a very influential book. It was carried by nearly every field surgeon in the Civil War on both sides. Do it with as much quickness as possible. Carry the knife around the member with one sweep. The hand which holds the knife being carried around under the limb. They would literally take your arm out. They would take the knife and they would bend down and they would drop it on the bone and they would wring it as fast as they could. Really, really good arm surgeons could do it in about 3 to 4 minutes. Leg surgeons took about 5 to 7 minutes. Okay? Because once they cut the meat and got the raggedy edge off, they shoved, this is fun this time of morning, they shoved the meat up the bone, took that saw, and they sawed off the bone and they let it come back on. Now they had to stop the bleeding. There's 2 ways to stop the bleeding. One's the tourniquet. What's another one? Cauterize it. Take a hot iron plate and slap it on that stump. Okay? So you can imagine that you would like to have one guy, and that is the fastest guy. All right, here's another example. These are called zoccoli. They are shoes from Italy in the 16th century. These are sort of pre-high heels, but these run from 12 to 14 inches high. Why would you want shoes like that, 12 to 14 inches high in 16th century Italy?
To keep your feet dry.
To keep your feet dry. Because the cities were awash in mud. Okay, and horse manure. So now we got about 4 slides on horse manure. You didn't think this could get any more exciting? We're talking horse manure now. Okay? 1898, the first urban planning conference was put together on one problem that was just the huge problem for all urban planners in America. What are we going to do with all the dang horse manure? This is from Morris in 2007. American cities were drowning in horse manure as well as other unpleasant byproducts of the predominant mode of transportation at the time. Urine, flies, congestion, carcasses, and traffic accidents. You don't think about traffic accidents with horses, but guess what? They were a mess. Okay? In 1880, there were approximately 15,000 dead horses in New York City. You can't haul a horse out on a cart, so they would let the horse sit and soften up a bit and putrefy, and then they would quarter the horses, literally quarter the horses, like cut them in quarters, and then they would transport them out of the city. Okay? In 1900, there's about 2.5 million pounds of horse manure in New York City alone per day. Per day. Now, you guys are econ majors, right? If this is your standard supply and demand analysis, and this is quantity, and this is the price of horse manure, and this is the demand for horse manure, why would there be a demand for horse manure? It's an excellent agricultural product. You spread it on your fields. Okay? It's great nitrogen. Here's the supply of horse manure. And now with all of these horses coming into the city, what's happening? Well, we're building up more and more and more horse manure, right? What's happening to the supply of horse manure? Right? So what's happening to the price of horse manure? Right? It's not even worth hauling it out of the city anymore, so what are you going to do with it? Well, we're going to pile it up in vacant lots. They had piles 40 to 60 feet high of horse manure in vacant lots in New York City. That's one thing if it's wet. It stinks, it smells, it's horrible, but when it dries out, it becomes airborne. They had massive problems because when a storm would come through, the stuff on the outside dried out, it would just blow horse manure dust all over the city. And then when the storm stopped, the sun would bake it, it would smell some more, but it would dry out about that much. And the next storm, guess what? That got distributed all through the city by... so if you think automobiles were dirty, go back 150 years, 100 years, to 1880, and walk around New York City, and not only New York City, any major metropolitan area at that time. They have the same problem. This is from Braudel. Braudel's really interesting to read. He's a French Marxist. He wrote a book on life as it was for people in the world between the 15th and 18th century. He's got chapters on lice. He's got chapters on sexual disease. He's got chapters on drinking. He's got chapters on housing. He's got chapters on foodstuffs. I mean, it's a 3-volume set. It's great to read. It's wonderful stuff. And the way that I introduce the CPI in my class, in a principles class, is with this slide. Okay? This is a pie chart that is the CPI, essentially, for a family of 5 in Berlin in 1800, where the father is a brick mason. Now, to you, that doesn't sound like much, but let me tell you what. In 1800, Berlin is a major metropolitan city, very cosmopolitan, in the middle of Europe. Okay, it is a great place to live. Being a brick mason in 1800 is like being a computer programmer in San Jose today. A brick mason was a highly skilled trade. It was a well-paid trade. You did pretty well. A family of 5, 1800. How much did they spend on food? 73% of their income was spent on food. 45% of the entire pie was bread. Okay? Beverages were 2%. Products of animal origin were 15%. Vegetable origin products were 11.5%. This is 3/4 of your income. How many of you spend 3/4 of your income on food? How many times did these guys go to Chick-fil-A? Hardee's, McDonald's. Let's go up. Ruth Chris Steakhouse. None of that, right? None of that existed. How much did we spend today on food in the CPI? Anybody know? Y'all should know that. Macro course. Give it a guess. Wild number. Just pull one out of your head.
20.
That's pretty close, 14%. You know that half of that is eating out in liquor? 7% is on food. Right? At home. Right? I mean, that's kind of stunning. This is an interactive graph. It's a little dated, but it's such a cool graph. I hate to get rid of it, but I'm not going to pull it up now because of time. I'll give these to Rob, and you guys can look at them if you want to. There's a bunch of stuff in them. Innovation and invention are important. How are we on time, by the way?
20.
What?
20 minutes.
20 minutes? Perfect. More than perfect. Innovation and invention is important. It's important that we have these things. The rate of innovation and pace has picked up significantly. The way, by the way, you want to make money, if you want to make a lot of money in this world, make something that the masses want to buy. Don't make Rolls Royces, make Chevrolets. Right? Windows DOS software was not the best software in the world. It's not the best operating system. But it's kind of the standard that got started and everybody could use it. You make money by producing for the masses. This is my recorded music story, which I really already told you about the progression of recorded music. That link is to some guy that's got a site in California University. I think it's at San Diego. And he documents all changes in recorded music since basically Edison did the rolling, the tin stuff and the horns and the basic vinyl records that were started by Edison. This is the total number of patents in the U.S. by year from 1790 forward. So when we read our history and we read about Ben Franklin invented all this stuff and Thomas Jefferson invented all this stuff, it's true. But the level of patents basically didn't do anything until about 1850. And then these patents start taking off, and there's a decline here. Why is there a decline here?
Depression.
The Depression. If we look under here, it's kind of the Depression era, 1929 to 1940. So there's a decline, but then this thing starts taking off, and look what happens here. In about 1980, this thing does the same thing that we saw before with GDP per capita. It just flat takes off. Why does this take off, do you think, in 1980?
Computers.
Computers is one. What else is driving this besides computers that will affect your lives dramatically?
Well, literacy rates are constantly increasing during that whole time period.
What's that?
Literacy.
Literacy rates? No, that would be a cause, right? So we're dividing in between dependent and independent variables. But what else would be patented heavily in the 80s and 90s? Biotech. Okay, all this biotech stuff, the mapping of the entire human genome, that is going to change your life dramatically. I'm thoroughly convinced that we will solve Alzheimer's, diabetes, epilepsy. It may be 50 years, it may be 100 years, but we're going to solve it. I'm telling you, it's coming. It may be 10 years. We're too old, right? We're gonna
We got to hurry here.
As a friend of mine said, how would you like to be the last generation to actually die? Your kids would go, Mom and Dad are so stupid, they actually died. Right? Okay. This is a number of patents from 1980 to 2010. I just threw this in recently because everybody's really pessimistic because, you know, these last 4 years, they've just been horrible. Nobody's been doing anything. Oh, wow, wait a minute. It did come down a little bit, but we're still looking at over 150,000 patents a year in every single year. In 2010, there were 220,000 patents. People are very active in this world, and you should be very thankful that they're active. That's how your grandparents get the hip replacement. This kind of stuff. Okay? And yet, the probability of commercial success is about 6.5%. That means that if you took 100 firms that started up commercially, that 6.5 make it. And that means 93.5 don't, which is kind of stunning. How have we done in America? This is a bunch of data. I can give you this. You can look it up. But I can tell you what got me started on all this in a bigger way. It was in 1997. I ran across a report from the Dallas Federal Reserve called Time Well Spent. And what it did was just fascinating to me. Instead of saying how much does a computer cost, or how much does a chicken cost, or how much does a tomato cost, they said how many minutes would an average industrial worker have to work to buy that chicken in 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, every decade. And it's absolutely stunning to look at. I couldn't believe it. I'm looking at the numbers and going, that can't be. And then I said, yeah, it is. That is absolutely a glorious story. There's all kinds of books. One of the books that they wrote at the end of, they wrote about 5 years of these reports. It's called Myths of Rich and Poor. There's something called The Rational Optimist that you might run into. It's a good book, Matt Ridley's book. That's not listed up here. Julian Simon and another guy, Moore, wrote another book. It's getting better all the time, 100 Great Trends in the Last 100 Years. That's a little dated. This is a little dated, but here's 2009, which is the next couple slides I got from this thing. This is also interesting, 100 years of consumer spending for the nation, New York City, and Boston. So there's a bunch of data out there. This is probably, if I could show you one slide and talk about it, this would be it. This is from Cox and Alm in 2009. I know it's kind of hard to see, so I'm going to point out some things. That's 1870. Okay, so what year is it now? 2010, more or less. How long ago was 1870? See, 30 years plus 100 years, 130 plus 10, about 140 years, right? Okay, I do math in little components in my head, right? So the average age that you started working in 1870 was 13. Anybody in here under 13? No? So all of you are working. Every one of you is working, on average. Not every one of you, but on average. By 2007, you're 20 before you start your work, on average. Okay? Life expectancy. In 1870, 43 and a half. I'm dead, he's dead, those three are dead. This guy, he's dead. Anybody else? I'll be nice.
George is dead.
A number of us, the guy in the corner, maybe the young lady in front of her, maybe getting close? Yeah. Close, yeah, that, you know, start writing your will. All right? 43 and a half. In 1950, it was 67 years old. One reason we have a huge problem with Social Security is you didn't get Social Security till you're 62, I think. We only had to pay you for 5 years, right? Now we're going to pay you for 15 years, 16 years, 17 years, right? The average age is 78, life expectancy today. Think about that alone. In 140 years, we went from a life expectancy of 43 and a half years to age 78. Has that ever happened in human history? No. That is stunning. Your retirement in 1870 was when you died. Nobody retired. Retirement at death. Today, the average retirement in 2007 is 62 and a half. That's going up a bit, by the way. Years on the job, number of hours worked, chores, retirement, you can see 0, 0, and in 1950 it's 0. Okay? This is the one, to me, that's the most fascinating number in the whole thing. It's the percent of time in the day, in your lifetime, that you were awake and working. Okay? In 1870, you spent 61% of your time awake and at work. Okay, so for every 10 hours, you spent over 6 hours in the field working. Most of you, by the way, were in the field because most people were agricultural workers. Okay, 61%. By 1950, that had fallen to 45%. By 1973, it's 35%. And in 2007, it's 28%. So when you think you work hard, guess what? Your forefathers would look at you and say, you wimp. We worked twice as many hours as you worked. Quit complaining and enjoy the cushy life that you have, because back here things were a lot different. We died at 43 and a half. We never retired. We spent 60%, over 60% of our time awake, working. This is safety at home and work. The work is the red. In about 1990, it became more likely that you would die at home than you would die at work. So worker safety has increased dramatically. That's kind of stunning that that number is where it is. So be careful on those ladders at home. Don't fall off the roof. This is a number on real compensation. This is average weekly work hours. Since 1947, as an index, they've come down some. Not a lot, but look at real compensation and wages. It's gone up dramatically. Now, one of the things that you get when you give this lecture is, well, that's great for Americans and Western Europeans and people in Australia and New Zealand. How about the rest of the poor saps in the world? Trust me, there is deep poverty in the world. Okay, there are places that you would not want to be born and you would not want to live. I've seen them. When you fly in to Guatemala City, or you fly in to Rio in Brazil, and you see acre upon acre upon acre of hovels that people are living in, you think, I am so lucky that I'm in the silver tube with the jet engines on it, and I'm not living down there. So let's not undersell that. But at the same time, let's recognize what's happened over the last 36 years. Between 1970 and 2006, poverty. Now this is poverty defined, by the way, at $1 a day. They just changed that to $1.25 a day. Okay? 86% it fell in South Asia. 73% in Latin America. 39% in the Middle East and 20% in Africa. All still hard, grinding, tough, difficult numbers. But this is dramatic increases in 36 years and pulling people out of poverty. How many people in China have been pulled out of poverty since they went from a communist system to a state communist system? State capitalist system.
I think 600 million.
600 million people. Think about that. How many people live in America?
300 million.
About 300 million. Twice the population of the United States has been pulled out of abject poverty by China in the last 20 or 30 years. Never more than 1 billion people will be in poverty at this level in the future history of mankind. That's stunning. There's 5 billion people in the world, more or less. Never more than 1 billion is great. This is just more about that. The poverty line has shrunk by nearly 64%. There were 970 million in 1970 as the number of people below $1 a day, and today there's 350 million. Again, they're talking about the fact that 1 billion people, more than 1 billion, will never live in this kind of poverty if the future holds. So, is the sky indeed falling? I would say not. You can get trapped in sort of, I don't like Obama, or I don't like Bush, or I don't like what's going on. Fine. If you want to watch MSNBC and Fox, go ahead. I'm not watching them anymore. I gave up on them about 2 decades ago. I know what they're going to say. I know what they're going to tell about each other. I know they're going to say, I am better than you, or as Art Carden puts it, put it on his quote most recently, most political posts on Facebook are that me is better than you, and you are less than Hitler. Something like that. I mean, it's just the level of conversation is just horrible, right? So let's be a little bit more optimistic. Let's not, get trapped in sort of the politics of the day. Yes, there are things that this country has to face, particularly the debt and the deficit, that you're going to have to deal with because we gave it to you. Thank you very much. We have to deal with the fact that we have bailouts at massive levels. In crony capitalism, we have the new, what I call the new mercantilism. I mean, it's worse than when Smith was around. Okay, but in the long scope of history, things are looking pretty darn good, and we should be thankful that we have capitalists and entrepreneurs and innovators. And I'll close with this. I have a couple things here. Anybody ever seen this or know what that is?
Wait, If that was generated by a 3D computer, I know what it is.
That was generated by a 3D computer. This is a car frame they built this body around. They also built on a 3D computer. Okay? This is as strong as steel. Okay? Just because it comes off the printer doesn't mean that it's necessarily not strong, right? This is the engineer that's working on it. This is the frame that he's sitting inside. Okay? I have a number of different videos here. I have like 5 or 6 videos. I'm going to pick one out to show you that I think will just knock your socks off. Because if you start to look around out there and think about what the future could behold, you should be stunned. I'm not a futurist. I'm not one of those guys that, you know, kind of, just look at today. I mean, that's plenty of future for me. Because what they're working on today and what they process will be used in the future. By the way, with 3D printer, there's 30,000 sockets for hip implants that are 3D printed now and implanted in people. It's not like this is space age, right? I mean, it is space age, but it's not like real space age. So let me see if I can pull this last video up, and we'll stop right there. I don't want to get one of those. This skin cell replacement's great to watch too, but this one has kind of captured me lately, so we'll.
Science fiction replicator, a replicate tool. A tool on Earth all of a sudden appears in space. That would be pretty cool, but we don't have that yet.
Or do we?
Can y'all hear it?
Theoretical physicist David Kaplan has found a company that replicates tools, and pretty much anything else you can imagine, with a 3D copy machine.
I'm in Burlington, Massachusetts at the Z Corporation, where they've developed a new technology that's similar to those replicators you see in sci-fi movies. It's called 3D printing. I'm here to find out if they can 3D print my crescent wrench.
We're one of the world's leading manufacturers of three-dimensional printers. Everything on the table in front of us has been printed in one of the machines behind us.
Printed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most printers will print things in 2 dimensions. A 3-dimensional printer will then take that to the 3rd dimension and make it something you hold in your hand.
Okay, I don't get it. And this?
That's just an example of the complexity of the things that you can make.
This moves.
It moves, and it was printed all as one piece.
This came out of a printer, just like this.
Came out of a printer just like that.
What is the material that makes this thing?
It's a specially engineered composite material that starts out as a powder. Then we add to it a binder material that solidifies those powder particles together.
These materials are the company's own secret recipe, a unique concoction not used anywhere else.
This is one of our 3-dimensional printers. There's a print head inside this machine that ejects specific fluids for coloring different parts.
Yeah.
But we also have a print head for printing our binder materials to solidify the parts.
Oh, God. The powder is the paper, and this binding stuff is the ink.
And then this tray here that it prints on will actually drop into the machine to give it that 3rd dimension.
Okay, I would like to see that. Could you reproduce this branch?
Absolutely.
It has moving parts here.
Not a problem. First thing we need to do is scan it.
All right.
Take a look?
Yeah. Let's see it. Here we go.
The scanner inputs every facet of the wrench into this computer, creating an image that will be sent to the printer.
Oh, that is cool. How accurately can you measure the shape?
The accuracy is within 40 microns.
That's like a human hair width.
Actually, a little less.
That's incredible. All right, so the wrench was scanned.
Here's the wrench that you did.
Okay, can you make that ring red?
Sure. I want to select it and paint so now that piece is red.
I see.
Just that simple. When we're ready, we just go down and hit print. All right, Dave. Printing's done. Let's take a look at your wrench.
Okay. I don't see anything.
It's in there. Just reach into the powder and pull out your wrench.
Okay. Holy cow. Wow.
Yeah, there's a real wrench right there.
Oh my God, you printed this.
Yeah, it came right out of the powder.
That's amazing.
So all that's left to do is blow off the rest of that powder.
That is cool.
Yeah.
A color 3D printer. I'm freaked out by this. It doesn't make sense. I'm holding this thing that has moving parts, and it just came out of a printer. Wow.
It's just that easy.
This changes everything. So how strong can this thing get?
You can get strength
Yeah.
just by infusing this with a little extra resin.
We can actually use it as a tool.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see if this really works. Can I really play hard?
Go for it, just as you would a real wrench.
Okay.
What do you think?
Wow. That's a real tool?
Yeah.
Holy cow. We just printed this.
Right. An hour and a half ago, there was nothing but a bunch of powder and binders.
There's a box of powder. That's
Yeah.
right. That is incredible.
And now you've got a real tool that you can use for functional tasks.
So going into space, you take a printer, and you can just print whatever you want.
That's right. Anything from the tools that you need or the actual object you're working on.
And I can keep the tool.
Absolutely. Go print
Okay.
another one.
Okay, good. So if you lose your tool in space, you can print out another one.
By the way, that's an airplane that they built, and they fly the plane. There's all kinds of, if you're interested, you can look this up on YouTube. Just look up 3D printer objects, and you'll find all kinds of stuff. So I'll leave you with this. You can get balled up in kind of what's going on in the day, but don't. There are very good signs about the future. We should be optimistic, and don't buy the pessimism. So thank you much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, that was great.
Enjoy the rest of the class day.
I had a friend I graduated college with, quit a job and became a printer salesman. If I was graduating today, I would want to be a printer salesman right there.
I'd rather
Absolutely.
I'd rather be the inventor.
Yeah, me too, but I couldn't.